Hello and welcome back to the second video in the iReal shaders tutorial series. In this video, I want to answer some questions regarding using iMetal for non-metallic objects. And we're going to see this by using the material ball scene, which you can find in your smart content under props and other, and it'll be the material ball scene. So I'm going to double click that and load that into the scene. And if you go to your surfaces tab, you'll find that the two surfaces that are selected by default are the outer sphere and the stand. This is the outer sphere and this is the stand. What I want to do is I want to convert these to iMetal, so I'm going to go ahead and navigate to my iMetal base shader. I'm going to go ahead and double click this to convert those two surfaces. And then what I want to do is I just want to go ahead and change these settings. So the defaults that come in here have been shifted. And so I just want to make them back to the default. So I'm just going to come over here to the gear and say reset. Come over to this gear, say reset. And I'm going to come over here to the base color and change this to black. However, I do not want to use the black that comes here, which is a value of 0, because what this is saying is that all light that strikes this object will be absorbed by this object like a black hole. And that's not a very real effect. Now, it can be useful in certain circumstances where you're having a lot of noise in your scenes and you want to absorb some of the extra bounces. If you hide a pure black object somewhere in the scene, you will be able to absorb those extra bounces and calm down the noise in your scene. However, for realism, we typically would find that a value of 13 would be our minimum value for a black. Now that I have this, I'm going to come over here to my iRay mode, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that on so that we can see this in our preview window. And what I want to do is I want to talk about the 3 different modes that we are working in when it comes to roughness. Now, the first thing I'll do is I'm just going to come over here to my anisotropy layer weight. I'm going to set this to 0, and my microabrasion layer weight, and I'm going to set that to 0. And I'm going to focus up here on my glossy layer weight, my glossy IOR, and my base roughness, because this is the first layer of roughness that we have to think about when we're dealing with iMetal. Now, this is true of metal materials and non-metallic materials. Now, the glossy layer weight is pretty self-explanatory. Because we do not have any microabrasion layer weight, we don't have any anisotropy layer weight. When I set this to 0, we're going to see nothing but a pure black diffuse material. You can see a slight amount of reflection coming here because we do have that set to a value of 13. However, it's a very small amount, and as a result, it looks as if it's a pure black material. If I increase the glossy layer weight, you'll see that we're going to be getting a layer of glossy top coat over the top of this that is going to be controlled by these 2 parameters right here, the glossy index of refraction, or IOR, and the base roughness. Now, the base roughness is pretty self-explanatory. You increase the roughness, you're going to get a rougher surface. If you decrease the roughness, you'll get a shinier surface, right? So specular versus glossy, basically. Now, the glossy IOR is going to be controlling the index of refraction for anything that is not metallic. So because this is 100% non-metallic right now, the index of refraction is going to be controlling that. Now, the lowest index of refraction that you can have is an index of refraction of 1. And what this is the index of refraction of void. And you can see that we're getting no reflections whatsoever anywhere on the surface. It's basically as if we have the glossy layer weight set to 0. However, as soon as I change this to anything higher than 1, and in this case I'll do 1.01, which would be the ND of air, you can begin to see some reflectivity at the outside edges. And what this is basically saying is that this is no longer void, now it is air. So it's the difference between space and air is basically the difference between these index of refraction. And the index of refraction of something like, say, water is 1.33. So you can see the reflectivity here is going to be very different than the reflectivity of the default, which is going to be 1.5, where you can see it's much more reflective now. So typically, for something like a plastic, a clear coat would be 1.491. That is a value that I typically use for anything that's going to have the clear coat of a plastic, a typical type of plastic. Now, you might find that different materials are going to have a different index of refraction, and that's the reason why this field exists here. If you need to find out what index of refraction is for your object, whatever it may be, if it's leather or if it's wood or whatever, typically wood is going to have a varnish, and the varnish is going to be somewhat close to this acrylic clear coat because a lot of varnishes are based on acrylic. But if you're looking for some other specific ND or index of refraction, then you can go online and find it. You just search on the words index of refraction and you'll find a couple of websites that have that information. What you're looking for is the number that is denoted as ND. And what that basically means is that there's different wavelengths of light. And the D wavelength of light is the specific number that we're looking for. Now, that said, we're going to go ahead and focus on what happens when we take this glossy layer that you have here and you add it into any of these other options that you have, microabrasion layer weight or anisotropy layer weight. So the way that the blending happens is from top to bottom, meaning that the glossy layer that we're working with right here is at the bottom. And as we add in microabrasion layer weight, we are adding something that's going to take over and it's going to become stronger and stronger until it finally obliterates the underlying layer of glossy layer weight. So you always want this to be lower than this, right? This would be the highest number, this would be lower, and then this would be the lowest as you're going. But the idea of microabrasion roughness is that we want a fairly rough surface. Here I have a value of 0.6. And what this is going to do is it's going to simulate micro roughnesses that are occurring in your object. Now, this could be anything from dust to scratches to any number of other things that could be happening on your surface that are microscopic, that are changing it, even though it might be a fairly shiny surface like what we have here. We're still adding in some of that roughness. And as a result, we're adding in a little bit more realism than we would get by simply increasing the roughness here, which is a uniform roughness. Now we're having a roughness of 0.11 or 11% rough. And we're also having a roughness of 0.60 at the same time, and it's controlled by this weight slider. So the less weight, you're going to have less of that 60% roughness in there. More weight, you'll have more of that 60% roughness in there. And of course, the glossy layer weight will obviously be something that you can modulate as well until you get exactly what you're looking for. And then finally, we have the anisotropy layer weight. And if I turn this all the way up, you'll see that this dominates as well. So I'm just going to set that glossy layer weight back to 1 so that we can fully see the anisotropy. Now, the anisotropy has its own roughness that you can control. Right now, the roughness is 0.40, but you can modify it to be higher. Now, the important thing to understand is if you have a highly rough surface or a highly anisotropic surface, then you will find that the surface will become darker as you increase this. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that roughness higher and higher. What you're going to find is that it becomes darker and darker. Now, there's a new feature that I'm going to be releasing soon. It'll be a free update for people who bought this, but it's going to be called multi-scatter. You won't have this, but it will be added soon, and it won't affect anything in terms of breaking anything. It's a purely optional thing. If you turn this on, it will increase the render time slightly, but what it'll do is it will take care of this darkening effect that you see here, and we'll get back to something that we can actually see the true lightness of this roughness here instead of having it be turning dark. It'll stay consistent from a light roughness to a heavy roughness, and it will never get dark like that. Likewise, if I turn this off and I go ahead and I set the anisotropy power all the way up, you'll see that it gets dark. If I turn this on, it won't get dark. So that is a fix that is new to iReal, and it works really well. However, it will add about 2.5% to your render time. So then, it could add an extra hour or two to your render time at the high end if it's a really difficult to resolve scene. I recommend not turning it on unless you are using it in a case where you're seeing too much darkness come in because of a high roughness or a high anisotropy. Most of the time you don't need it, but in cases when you need it, you really need it, and that's why I've added it into the shader. Right now I'm just looking to see if there's any bugs that are reported that I can fix, and then I'll go ahead and submit this to DAZ so that they can send it out to users as an update. It'll probably take a couple weeks. But that is a new feature. And like I said, it won't break anything. Materials that you make now will not be any different when this comes out. You'll simply have the option of turning this toggle on when it appears. So that said, I do want to focus on what this anisotropy layer weight does. So again, I'm going to go ahead and reduce the roughness back down so that we can really see the anisotropy. I have the anisotropy power, right? So that's just going to control how much that light is being pulled around the surface as if it was brushed metal. And I also have anisotropy rotations, which is going to control the angle at which that brushing is occurring. Now, you can load textures in any of these slots and control all this, but you can also come over here to your anisotropy power and just set it all the way down to the lowest value, which would be 0.001. The reason why it's not set to 0 is because I found that there was errors in iReal if you set it all the way down to 0. So as a result, basically what we have here is a roughness of 0.34. Now remember, we have a roughness here of 0.11. We have a roughness here of 0.6. So if I reduce this anisotropy layer weight, we're effectively blending 3 different roughnesses together in order to create a very complex roughness effect. Now, of course, I can always come back in here and add in some of that anisotropy in order to pull that light slightly and create whatever kinds of complex effects that I want. But this is the real power of working with iMetal, is that you are able to create and simulate multiple different roughnesses going at the same time. Whereas in the iRay Uber shader, the only way that you could do this is by either using, if you're not working with a metal object, the dual lobe specular, or you could also create a top coat and have it have a different roughness from the base glossy layer. But the problem is that all of these add complexity that is really kind of difficult to manage for most users. And the way that I've set it up here in the iMetal shader is that it will be something that will work not only on our metal objects, but also on our glossy objects exactly the same. So we don't really have to worry about having an effect that looks great on our non-metallic objects, but then doesn't transfer over to our metal objects. It's basically the same. It's a one-to-one effect, and as a result, it's going to be real nice. Now, one thing that I will point out to you is one of my rules is that if you have a high roughness, you're going to start to get kind of a powdery look. And this is when you would take that glossy layer weight, which basically controls all of the glossy layers at once, and you just reduce that down until you get something that looks about the reflectivity that you feel is respectable for that object. So maybe on this particular object, I found that the glossy layer weight of 0.5 looks good for this object and gives me that complex multi-layered roughness. Now, in the case of something like a varnish, we might find that our base roughness looks best at something like 0.01, which would be 1% roughness. And we're going to see that we have this nice, strong specular highlight that's a result of this layer's contribution. But then we also have a high roughness and we have a medium roughness with a little bit of anisotropy that's going to be blended into that to create a much more complex effect than we would get if we simply turn these two layers off. You'll see that it becomes very kind of monotonous and one tone and it loses a lot of reality. And then, of course, in addition to having just a small amount of these guys in here, you can map these guys, each of these guys, to be whatever you want them to be to create really complex roughness effects, things that you could never ever get. Well, I'll be perfectly honest. Dual lobe specular is great for non-metallic objects like this, except for the second lobe in the dual lobe specular does not respect your bump and your normal map. And as a result, you can get kind of weird looking results. And everything that we have here with our glossy layer weight, our microabrasion layer weight, and our anisotropy layer weight respects the bump and normal map. And as a result, you will get much better results than you would from dual lobe specular. Now, that's not me trying to pick at DAS too much. I did report this to them a long time ago, and as far as I know, they never did anything about it. So as a result, they must be happy with the way that it works, or maybe they can't do anything about the way that it works, but my fix definitely works. So it works great on metallic objects, it works great on non-metallic objects, and it always works with bump and normal as well as obviously displacement. So you can see now that you could use this to create a wood floor, for instance, that's shiny, but yet still has a little bit of roughness to it at a low level via the microabrasion layer weight and the anisotropy layer weight that would indicate people walking over that floor and scuffing it up and creating small scratches that you would never be able to perceive with the eye, but your eye can tell that, wow, it looks shiny, it's also a little bit rough at the same time. Same thing could be true of plastics, and obviously things like leathers, you might be able to take advantage of having a strong specular that really shows off the texture of the leather, but at the same time, there's a roughness to it because leather has microscopic pores and whatnot. And a bump map may not be small enough to capture all of that, whereas the microabrasion is a lower level of detail than even, say, a bump map can do because a bump map is limited by your pixel resolution, whereas microabrasion happens basically at a microscopic level, but does the same thing as what a bump or normal map would do in terms of simulating the roughness of a surface. So that's it. Hopefully you learned something about working with iMetal for non-metallic objects. And in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about metallic objects.